Welcome back, everybody. I'm Dr. Greg Eckel. This is What the Health. Today's topic is understanding how your genetics can improve your cognition. My guest today is Elwin Robinson. He's the founder of Genetic Insights and the author of the Rejuvenate Blueprint, resolving the 7 root causes of all chronic disease. Welcome aboard, Elwin.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, you're very welcome. I love this talk. And in light of the advances in computers and with the large language databases and talking about genetics, I am curious how you got into founding a company called Genetic Insights.
Mm. Yeah, well, I've kind of been in the health business almost accidentally for 14 years now. But both my parents were kind of into it for different reasons. My father was a biochemist and a science teacher who was really into organic farming and organic foods and stuff like that back even in the 1980s. My mother had cancer several times throughout my life and died not when I was very young, but when I was in my early 20s, so pretty young. And so my house was always filled with health stuff. There was, weird foods everywhere, supplement bottles everywhere, stacks of bookshelves everywhere with information on alternative health. So it's very much part of my programming. But honestly, I kind of rebelled against it for that reason. In my teenage years and up until my late 20s, I was smoking, drinking, doing drugs, and all that kind of bad stuff. And my mother had cancer several times. My dad had ME and CFS. He ended up not being able to work because of that. And in my late 20s, I ended up in a similar position where I was signed off work by a doctor for a while because of stress and exhaustion. I was like, oh, I'm going down a really bad road here. And so I started doing a lot of the kind of usual things that they recommend for health. Dr. Greg, like stop smoking, stop drinking alcohol, stop eating junk food.
Sure.
I was already exercising, but trying to reduce my stress. I quit a very high stress job and took a very easy job, that kind of stuff. And I got really into health. At the time, I was especially into the raw food, raw vegan movement, and I was like seriously purifying my diet, if nothing else, even if perhaps that's not the best diet, and I wouldn't probably recommend it to people. Still, at least it is a purer diet, I guess, than most people are having. So I did that for a few years, did detoxes, cleanses, and all that. And I did start feeling so much better in all kinds of ways, both physically, health-wise, and energy, and also, I would say, psychology. I went from, as I said, basically being a drug addict who was constantly in debt and working a minimum wage job to starting to think about, what could I do to actually make the world a better place? And I'd worked as a chef before that. And I decided to get a job as a chef in a raw food health restaurant. And I guess I'd learned enough that people kept asking me for my advice and kept asking me for help. And eventually I was like, I was going to start putting up some YouTube clips about, it's like some simple stuff um, doing consults and people asking me where to get the stuff I recommended. So then I set up a supplement store. And so it was all extremely organic and unplanned like that. But eventually I had a good following and a good business, and I was traveling the world doing speeches, and I had a bunch of courses and a book and all of that kind of stuff, and everything was good. And to be honest, for a while, even so I spent maybe about 10 years during that time studying health. But eventually, because my health was fine, I kind of wasn't really interested in it anymore as much, and so I was focusing more on the business and, I started working with someone else and helping them grow their business and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, I got to the age of 39 years old. I thought I had it all figured out enough that, as I said, I was teaching stuff. And then suddenly I started to get this stabbing pain in my right midsection area around my lower ribs. And I was quite aware of the kind of Taoist system of health back then. And so I immediately thought, liver and gallbladder, as you would, if that's the system that you are in. And the first thing I did is went to a medical doctor, and they could not find any problems, even with an MRI, a CT, bloods, endoscopy, all of that kind of stuff. I went to several medical doctors, in fact, initially, private, eventually, initially, what we have over here, like NHS. And then I went to all the kind of standard practitioners, I would say, functional medicine nutritionist, naturopath, all of those kind of people. They all gave me interesting insights. I learned a lot of interesting stuff along the way, but no one could work out what was wrong with me. Then I was like, okay, well, maybe it's a structural issue, right? If you have pain here, it could be a rib, could be a muscle, could be a fascia, could be something like that. So then I saw a physio and a craniosacral therapist and an osteopath and acupuncturist and all of those kind of people. And again, I learned a lot and it was all very good, but it didn't help. Now, by this point, I'd always been a bit underweight and always had a bit of digestive issues. That was like the only thing that I had still in my 30s. Like I had a few food intolerances, and I thought, it's just it's just the way it is, normal. Um, but like this pain was of a specific type that it got worse pretty much when I ate anything, which is also why I thought it was the liver. And painkillers did not work for it. Because I know a lot of people over the age of 40 have chronic pain. I think it's like over 50%.
Mm.
But usually, like if NSAIDs don't work, they put you on opioids, right, to control the pain. So there's a specific type of pains that NSAIDs didn't work, and opioids actually made it much worse. So there was no type of painkiller that was actually effective. And so, as you can imagine, I was kind of put off eating, and I lost a lot of weight. I ended up being 120 pounds, 6'3", pretty emaciated. I felt cold all the time. I started to get arrhythmia. I had constant anxiety. I couldn't sleep. I was in it's probably the worst state of my life, and certainly the worst state while no one could work out what was wrong with me. No one had any idea as to what was causing this pain and what was causing this issue. Eventually, with all these people kind of treating me as if maybe I was making it up, I thought maybe I am. Maybe it's some kind of emotional issue.
Yeah,
Um, so
sure.
I did the kind of traditional therapy thing, which I'd never been keen on, but I started doing that and working on those levels. Also did more, like I did Joe Dispenza's whole thing of meditation every day, focusing on, being healed and all that kind of stuff, and all kinds of stuff, emotions, trauma, different kind of energy-based systems and all the rest of it. And they were all very interesting and I learned a lot, but none of those helped either. And in fact, often they would make it worse. Often after a session of meditation or whatever, I feel like in a blissful state, and then like half an hour later, this pain would be back and worse than ever. And I was like, what is this? Um, and so I did a lot of self-testing as well. I was in a very fortunate position. I felt very embarrassed, as you imagine. You've been teaching health for 10 years and suddenly you have this thing that you
Boy.
can't work out.
Yeah.
Admittedly, no one else could either, so that should have helped a bit, but it didn't really. I was still
Yeah.
very mortified and determined to work out what was going on many levels. Um, and so I'd spent a lot of money on testing. None of it had really was, brought up anything. And then I came across this thing that said, if you've ever done a test before, like 23andMe, an ancestry service, then you can upload your data from that, and within a few hours, we can give you all this information about your health. And it promised such a wide variety of reports and information. I was like, sounds worth a try, right? And so I did it, and I was blown away with how accurate it was.
Mm.
And it was interesting to me because some of the things that it said I had, which I had then, when I had my DNA tested in 2013, I didn't have any of those problems. So, I know that's kind of obvious to you probably, that because these things stay the same, the SNPs stay the same throughout your entire lifespan. But, just on an emotional level, it's like, oh my God, if only I'd have known this information back then, I almost certainly could have prevented all of these issues occurring. And so I was like, that's amazing. Now, I wish I could say, because it makes a nice story, it told me what was wrong with it and I fixed it and the end, but it wasn't quite as simple as that. What it did is it gave me clues to work out what was going on, that when I did further testing to confirm, and then, went down those pathways, I managed to work it out, get a proper diagnosis, and then actually resolve it. And I was like, maybe, this is just me. So I got my wife to try it, got several of my business partners to try it, several friends, family members, employees. And, after having seen like a couple of dozen people and gone through the results with them and, learn, I was like, this is really incredibly interesting and incredibly helpful. And so but the problem was I kind of had to go through it with them, because we were talking about this before we started recording. A lot of these platforms, they're quite practitioner focused, like someone who doesn't have, a fairly in-depth intimate understanding about just health in general, let alone also genetics, they're not going to understand most of it. And so I wanted to create something that was just as, insightful, with just this, huge comprehensive amount of accurate information, but that was a bit simpler for the person to use, in fact, significantly simpler, and then also more affordable, because they can often be pretty expensive. The good ones can be pretty expensive. So I wanted to make it like more affordable than, any other comparable test by far. And so that, to answer your question, is how
Yeah.
I ended up founding Genetic Insights.
No, and that's perfect. And it's oftentimes the healing journey that we innovate like this. I'm wondering, just for our lay listeners and viewers, like, are all genetic tests created equal?
So there's the test, and then there's the interpretation of the data. So first of
Okay.
all, I should probably make that distinction.
Yeah.
So I'd say, in terms of the actual test, if they're doing any of the kind of ancestry services, I mean, there is definitely some differences in what they do and don't test for. So they're not all created equal, but they're all kind of good enough. So if you've done Ancestry.com, if you've done 23andMe, if you've done MyHeritage, if you've done any of the popular ones, they test for enough of the important SNPs that we can then take that data and we can come up with accurate risk scores and recommendations based on them. So that's kind of the good news. If you've ever done any of these big services before, actually probably is good enough. Now, ironically, often the people who do the health ones, it's not good enough, because often if you say you've had it done with a functional medicine doctor or a nutritionist or something like that, often they just test a handful of SNPs. They've just tested 3, or they've just tested a dozen or something. And
Right.
yeah, and that's not helpful. We do need, it's not a full genome, because of course most of the genome is stuff that is not relevant, but we need like a full list of the SNPs that have been studied and researched, which, as I said, most of these ancestry services do a good enough job on that. In terms of the interpretation, to answer your question,
Yeah.
there is a huge variation in the quality of the interpretation. And I'd say I put that down to, well, at least 2 major factors. One of them is the level of sophistication of the interpretation that's being done. And we talked about this again before we started recording, that in my experience, unfortunately, most of the services out there that have got the most popularity, often due to, sophisticated and marketing, maybe they spent a lot of money on marketing and sales, they're actually the most simplistic, unhelpful potentially services, because all they do is they take this huge file. You get this huge file from many of these services, this raw data it's called, where they list a huge amount of these different SNPs, which stands for single nucleotide polymorphism. It's basically just one variation, one difference in your genetic code, and then you can easily, anyone can do this. You can hire a software developer and go, pick out this SNP, and then you can hire a scientific writer and go, tell them what it means. And so most of the systems out there are basically that, which, as I said, anyone can do. They pick out, they say, okay, you have this SNP, and this means this about you. It means you need more vitamin B12. It means that you're more likely to be stressed. It means you're more likely to die of heart disease, like whatever it might be. But
Mhm.
the problem with that is that it's only one isolated variable. And so anything, now there are exceptions to this. There are a few things, like, for instance, with nutritional needs. It's true that if there is just one SNP difference, that may well mean you need more of a certain nutrient or something like that. Certainly we have those reports as well. It's true. But when you're trying to evaluate something like your cardiovascular health and what the risk is of you getting, heart health issues later in life, which of course is super important, because first of all, 40 to 50% of people die of that. And then second of all, it's called the silent killer for a reason, right? Which is, unless you test these markers regularly, you have no idea you have a problem until you have a severe problem. So this is really, really important. And so I would say to someone, oh, you don't have a genetic risk for heart health problem just based on one SNP or even just a handful of SNPs, is so inaccurate. It's verging on irresponsible in both directions. You could tell someone, oh, you have a high risk based on this SNP. It's like, but there's so many other, genetic factors, let alone also lifestyle and environmental factors on top of it. But just in terms of genetic factors, so for our report for cardiovascular heart health, we're analyzing tens of thousands of SNPs, and
Mhm.
so that AI that actually does that analysis is built by and maintained by several dozen full-time AI engineers. The process of deciding with each SNP how important it is, how much should we weight it, in terms of coming up with the risk analysis, and then what are all the studies that show that it potentially, like, so if you have this SNP, then this nutrient might be helpful. If you have this SNP, then this lifestyle intervention may be helpful. And like, but then if you have this other SNP, it says it's not helpful after all. So like, balancing all of that and coming up with an overall conclusion, which otherwise you'd have to have a very skilled and knowledgeable practitioner to do, right? If they just had the SNPs in front of them, they'd have to go, oh, as far as I know, this balances out this, and this cancels out this, and this is more important than this. So like our system, and we're not the only one, but our system does that. It actually does that proper analysis, coming up with and again, not to say it's perfect. I mean, as more research comes out and more data is available, we do update regularly.
Added to it. Yeah.
Yeah, but to at least come up with the best possible conclusion that the current research allows, rather than this extremely simplistic, oh, you just have this, therefore this. And then the other thing I would say that, sets, and again, we're not the only one, I'm not trying to say that, but like a system like ours apart, is that the recommendations. Like I say to people, if all we could give people is risk scores, I would not do this, because that can be extremely disempowering, right? It's like, oh, you're in the top 5 percentile, 95th percentile for having, a high risk for heart health issues, or for developing diabetes, or whatever it might be. Like, that's not good to tell someone. Like, you mentioned my 7-step system in my intro there. Like, I think one of the 7 root causes of all chronic disease is the placebo and the nocebo effect, right? The belief that we have in our mind. So if you say to someone, you have a high risk of developing this disease, that's basically like putting a curse on someone if that's all you're doing. You
Yeah.
have to also say to them, and based on your genetics, here are the things that are shown that for you are specifically helpful. And if you
Yeah.
just do the top recommendations, you're going to make a massive difference. And so I'd say, now I know a lot of other companies give recommendations, but often it's just like supplements or something. Like,
Mhm.
supplements are almost never in our top 3. I'm not against supplements. I take probably too many of them. I have a whole cupboard full of them. Like, I'm a
You
fan
and me
of them.
both. Yeah. Yep.
But they shouldn't be in the top 3 in most cases, right? When we're talking about like health issues.
Yeah.
And so, we give lifestyle recommendations, dietary recommendations. That's it. We don't actually give medication. That's like a separate thing. But
Sure.
yeah.
So one comment on that is you're not going to be able to supplement your way out of a bag of potato chips. So that's the underlying understanding. But secondly, when folks, I think some of the misperceptions around genetics, one, like, are you destined to express the gene even though you have the SNP? So like, I guess
Mhm.
this would bring in, like, how does epigenetics fall in here
Yeah.
with your platform and your discussion here? Because I think a lot of times folks, in the past, they would say, oh, I don't want to know because there's nothing I can do about it. Or, or you have George Burns, who used to play God in the movies, and drinking his scotch and smoking cigars. And when asked, like, well, what do your physicians say, George? He says, oh, they say nothing. They're all dead. He's 98 years old, and he was blessed with genetics that could handle a lifestyle like that. So how do you
Mm.
tie that in before we dive in specifically of how does knowing about your genetics help improve, with your cognition and or brain health? This more meta discussion on overall, how do you place this in, like, are you destined because of your genes
It's
to
a great question, and I can tell you're very experienced in this field, because when I first put the page together about our services, I didn't include like addressing this, and I need to update it because it is the number one thing that people are concerned about, and rightly so. So I'd say, going back philosophically thousands of years, there's always been that conflict in the way people think between the idea of fate versus free will, right? So the people on the fate side, they tend to believe it's going to happen. There's nothing I can do about it. But the people on the free will side tend to be like, I can manifest my own, life. I can create my own destiny. I don't have to be held back by the chains of the past, all that kind of stuff. Now, I
Yeah.
can say, Dr. Grant, I never imagined I'd be someone who had a genetics asset company because very simply, I was very much in that second camp, for my late 20s and all my 30s. I didn't like the idea that there was anything holding me back and that there's anything stopping me from, being who I wanted to be and all the rest of it. So it's been very sobering and humbling, which is a great thing,
Yeah.
to realize that, we're all dealt a certain set of cards. We have certain advantages and we have certain disadvantages. Now, to actually answer your question, it is not set in stone, but it is a factor, So if we use the cards you dealt analogy, for any poker players out there, if you're dealt a bad hand, you can still win. It's just more difficult. And ditto, you can actually also win, you can lose even if you have a straight flush if you are very unlucky or if you play it wrong. So
Yeah.
there is so here's what I've observed in practice, having seen a lot of people's results. Generally, by the time someone's in their 30s or 40s, late 30s or 40s, so one of the ways we can, we have over 500 reports in our membership, system. The ones right at the top, if we sort by risk, are often like you're in the top, 99th percentile, something like that. By the time someone's in their late 30s or 40s, I very rarely see where they haven't manifested that. Either they haven't already got it or they have had it at some point. For me, for instance, as I said, I thought I was being healthy, but there were some serious things I was missing. Like one of the things that were right at the top was like sinus problems. And it's true, I'd had that my whole life, from teenager onwards. And so, the question would be, was I destined to have that, or was there anything I could have done to prevent that? Well, I was also having, loads of inorganic pasteurized dairy. I was also smoking lots of cigarettes, so like obviously lots of things that were irritating my sinuses potentially. So I have seen that the average normal person who lives the average normal lifestyle, they've usually manifested the things that are the highest risk for. However, I work with two groups of people, often people who are like me, who have really tried everything and nothing's worked. But then I also speak to a lot of people like maybe yourself, who are influencers, experts, thought leaders, and people who've really been into this for a long time and living a healthy lifestyle for a long time. And honestly, when I go through their results to them, it's always the most difficult because I want to go through it with a normal person. It's like, oh my God, they're so amazing. They're so accurate. They're so whatever. And then I just had it last week with the doctor. I went through it and she was like, no, don't have that. Don't have that. Don't have
Right.
that problem. And it's frustrating for me, of course, because I'm trying to show that the system works because I want them to use it
Yes.
with their clients and their patients. But what I do then in that case is I go through with them and I say, okay, fair enough. Let's look at this one. You've got a really high risk score. You haven't ever had it. Fair enough. I acknowledge that, it seems to be wrong. That's fine. And then I look at the report itself and we scroll down to the recommendations. And often the report's like majority recommendations. And I always say, if you do the top 3 recommendations, that's often more impactful than doing like the next 10, like that's the most important. And I say, are you doing this recommendation? Oh yeah, I've been doing that for years. Are you doing this recommendation? Yeah, I've been doing that on and off for my whole life. Are you doing this? So I see that again and again, that when people actually have been doing it for a long time, because a lot of these things are not things you haven't heard of. A lot of them are,
Sure.
things that you're already familiar with. Like it actually works, actually make a difference. So to go back to epigenetics, some people ask me to quantify it. They say, well, how much of it is genetics and how much of it is lifestyle, environment, and all the stuff
Yeah.
that you can control? And I used to say, oh, you can't answer that. But you know what? I actually give an answer these days because I've seen so many reports and often we give you an estimate for that. So for instance, with heart health, the figure we give is about 40%. So about 40% is genetics, 60% is environment and lifestyle. Obviously, that's an estimate. That's not exact, but it gives you some kind of idea. And honestly, what I have found, some things, the report says only 10% of it is genetics. Sometimes it's, quite a high percent. And obviously, there are some things like, your eye color and all the rest of it that's
Sure.
99 point something percent, set in stone. Although usually we don't have reports about that, but we do have some reports on things that you can't change, more like traits and, personality, and sleeping habits and, what kind of foods work for you, even nutritional needs, um, you're not necessarily going to have a nutritional deficiency because of genetics, but if you have an increased need for a nutrient, Um, that's not going to change, right? Like,
Right.
so that's like a very high chance that basically you're going to have it. And I see that again and again and again when people have, because I encourage people to test based on what we show them, not to just, usually not to take action based on what we show them. I mean, if your nutritional needs says that you need more, like glycine or vitamin B12, I say go for it because these things are pretty safe to have. But if it says you need more iron or vitamin D3 or anything like that, I say test because you can easily have too much of those things. So you want to actually confirm it. So I do see a lot of people who do follow up testing, and I'm amazed at how often and how accurate it is. Even Dr. Greg, down to the amino acids, it'll say you have an increased need for lysine, you have an increased need for tyrosine, you have an increased need to methionine, all these kind of things.
Yeah.
And you can see it actually has a big impact in their life. I had one client, this is kind of related to brain and because it's a nervous system issue. He had chronic anxiety for 40 years. He'd spent hundreds of thousands of dollars in trying to resolve it. He tried every kind of treatment from normal therapy to ayahuasca to all
Geez.
kinds Reiki, all kinds of everything. And he had an elevated need for the amino acid glycine. And glycine is an amino acid that is not found in huge quantities in anything other than animal connective tissue, where it's like 20% of the total protein. And then he had been like vegetarian for a long time, and even when he was eating animals, he was never eating like bone broth or anything like that. So I
Yeah.
just got him on glycine. And there was loads of other stuff I gave him to do, and he hadn't got around to most of it. I said, you need to see a doctor to test for this. He hadn't got around to any of that. All he started doing his glycine and a couple of herbs. And he said the anxiety is gone. 40 years of anxiety has disappeared. Now, does that mean that that's going to happen for every person who has anxiety who takes glycine? No. The vast majority it probably won't work for. And that's the point. It's like finding the thing. So, sorry, I've gone on a tangent. To answer the original question, the epigenetics absolutely do matter. But in this case, with that story I just told, I guess, that guy's always going to need more glycine. He
Right.
doesn't necessarily have to supplement. He can just, eat more of the foods that contain it naturally. But that's not going to change. In a lot of other cases, the vast majority is environment and lifestyle, and genetics play very little part. And often in the major things like a risk of heart disease and diabetes and respiratory health and poisonings and all the things that actually kill people, it is around 40% I see. So genetics do play like a significant part.
Interesting. I've been in practice for 25 years. I typically said 33% of the time do people express their genes just like their parents did. Now, I had no data to go on other than anecdotally what I was seeing,
Yeah.
in talking to my patients, hearing their family history and what was going on with them. But, now you're running loads of the genetic data and it's a different world, 25 years later.
Yeah.
And so
Even
to
5
hear
years ago.
40%, I wasn't too far off with that.
And that's my estimate. You may
Yeah,
end up being right. I mean, but
right.
it's around that level. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I guess just to reiterate, it doesn't mean you're destined by your genes, but they definitely, the way that I talk about it is it kind of puts you to the front of the line of we take the guessing out on your platform, and then we have a much better starting spot. Of course, you can always do trial and error, but it could take 40 years, like your friend with the anxiety,
Mm.
to figure out a result where this kind of could streamline it and put you at least to like what are the best, most probable interventions to create change. So
Yes.
that leads into, and we will get to this cognition and brain health discussion, but on how accurate are these for determining diet and exercise regimens for people?
Vary down to even a granular level. So again, I think a lot of systems out there are overly simplistic. They're like, are you this type or are you that type? And sometimes I dabble in that kind of thing. But I think in reality, different people have different needs all the way down to, as I said, like the individual amino acid and the individual micronutrient. And so
Mhm.
understanding that, I think, can finally give you the key. Plus, of course, when it comes to dietary, the other big thing is how well you digest. So we have, a whole category based on that with lots of reports. And there's what foods does your body treat as if they are a poison, or what foods contain things that your body struggles to detoxify. So, for instance, oxalates, histamines, and salicylates are, poison-ish things that are naturally found in foods that your body quote unquote should be able to process and deal with without any problem, but that there's a certain subset of people who have specific genetic variants and possibly other environmental stuff going on as well. That means that they do not deal with those things very well. And so, that's another book I didn't, it's not in the intro, but it's the other book that I have forthcoming is the, the Rejuvenate diet. And I call it that because everyone wants to call it a diet, but it's a non-diet diet. Like one of my central precepts of that is there is literally nothing that is good for everyone.
Yeah.
Like what is medicine to one person might be poison for another. I ask people, I can ask yourself if you can think of any exceptions to that. The only thing I can think of is maybe like an air purifier or a water purifier that's like beneficial
Right.
for everyone. But almost anything else, even any type of regimen and sunlight, some people have an issue with that. Fresh air, some people have an issue with that. Like any kind of food, some people have an issue with that. So
Yeah.
like you really got to take it on a case by case basis. And so I would say, so long as you are not looking for simple one size fits all answers, this is the very best approach. And as I said, I wouldn't base everything purely on what the genetics say, but the combination of starting with the genetics, that's why it's the first step of my 7-step system. Start with genetics and then go, oh, maybe I need to test for these food intolerances. Maybe I need to test for these nutritional deficiencies. Maybe I need to test to see if I have an excess level of these toxins. Maybe I need to test to see if I have these hormonal imbalances or neurotransmitter imbalances or whatever it might be. Like these are the basic things which I often see as like the root cause of all this disease and
Yeah.
lack of wellness. And to start with genetics and then do, in most cases, do further testing to validate. As I said, again and again, it can be life-changing. And sometimes it's just an amino acid, sometimes it's just a hormone, sometimes it's just a herb that, adapts the hormone, or
Yeah.
like, and sometimes it's a simple lifestyle change. And these things can have a massive effect because of the weakest link idea, like it's the weakest link in the chain. You're only as strong as your weakest link. And so if you have say a deficiency in something obscure you might not even heard of, like molybdenum or
Mhm.
alanine or something like that. These are things, and no guru is going to tell you your health problems are caused by, like it's very unlikely.
Right.
And yet it could be the thing for you, which makes the biggest difference of all.
Interesting. Well, great. So, now we've wound them up. We've wound up to the punchline. So, you know, this aspect of utilizing your genetic platform for program development to create cutting edge therapeutics and specifically around brain health, what are some examples of patterns that you've seen and or some maybe, not without geeking out too much, but getting into some of it. Some of the names of the SNPs or things that you consider when you're thinking about brain health for folks.
Sure. I mean, honestly, I don't usually focus on individual SNPs. That is one of the
Yeah.
differences,
Perfect.
for our
Yeah.
system to other people's. I sometimes focus on genes, maybe, but not
Or
specifics.
pathways, I think. Or
Yeah,
no,
yeah.
you don't have it that way. However you take that question, go with it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would start with the basics, honestly, which may sound boring to say, but I have our category in front of me, our brain health category, and it contains like obvious stuff that you might assume that there would be a report on, like cognitive decline, short-term memory, verbal ability, cognition, and things like diabetic neuropathy, peripheral neuropathy, like these kind of things that very much speak to the potential degradation of the nervous system. And then we also have things in there about relevant nutrients, relevant neurotransmitters, relevant genes. Some of the genes that I include in there, for instance, are COMT and BDEMF. But usually I wouldn't start with any of that stuff I just said. I would actually start with like for instance, a stress report. I would look at an inflammation report. I would look at a blood sugar, like a hypoglycemia report. I would look at an arterial health report. I would look at, let's just see. Well, let's just start with those ones, for instance, because
Sure.
a lot of actually, yeah, and oh yeah, and I would look at a like a basic hormonal report in most cases as well, because um I think this is my theory. I wonder if you agree that a lack of thyroid function is like an epidemic in our society that is undiagnosed. 100 years ago, it was common, 30% of people roughly were considered to have low thyroid function. The common symptoms are being overweight, dry skin, constipation, but also digestive problems in general, allergies and intolerances, chronic infections, edema, and anxiety and or depression, and lack of cognitive function as well. It's a
Yeah,
crucial part of it. And why doctors, medical doctors, often don't like to, if you go in with all those symptoms. Oh, and fatigue, sorry, the most obvious one. And
sure.
when you go in with such a broad section of symptoms, they don't like it because it's too diverse, and they're like, oh, you're making it up, or it's just
Yeah,
whatever, and they'll kind of fob you off. But the truth is that all of those things I just said, and it's very common, and probably a lot of people listening to this can relate to maybe most of them, is because they're all basically down to one simple thing, which is a lack of energy, right? A lack of energy on the cellular mitochondrial level. Now, a lack of energy on the cellular mitochondrial level can be down to things other than thyroid, of course, right? And one of the things is anemia. Commonly, it's something that doctors do routinely test for, right? And
yeah,
especially in women, that commonly is an issue. But I see so often like people focusing on mitochondrial health and metabolic health and all the rest of it, and they're talking about like carnitine, they're talking about CoQ10, all this stuff, and I'm like, but what about thyroid? What about the very thing that tells the mitochondria to create energy in the first place? And so,
mm,
one of the things, if someone has cognitive issues, before I looked at BDMF or like any of these more, advanced things, I'd be looking at, okay, so first of all, is your body creating enough energy? Because, and here's the distinction I would say that helps, on a clinical level to identify this is the issue. If you're still reasonably mentally sharp, but your problem is more like memory, then I often say that that would be a thyroid issue. And the reason being, because my understanding is when you have low cellular energy, when you have low mitochondrial energy, which I relate to, say, chi in the Eastern system,
sure.
your body has to go into its, in the Eastern system, reserve energy, its jing, which I would relate more to, adrenal overactivation from a Western point of view. And so the adrenaline goes up, the cortisol goes up. When those systems go up, the body prioritizes the survival functions. So there's plenty of energy for the heart, there's plenty of energy for the lungs, there's plenty of energy for the muscles, there's plenty of energy for some of the functions of the brain, like the ability to focus. But the more luxury functions, like the immune system, like the detoxification system, and from my experience, like the memory system, is often what suffers. So I see that again when people like, I'm still sharp enough to like do stuff, but I keep forgetting stuff. And then I see that they have this pattern of like what I call adrenaline dominance, although I got the term from Dr. Michael Platt, who coined it. And so that, I would say, if you can relate to that, then I would look at a lack of fundamental energy before I look at the brain specifically. So that's why I bring that up and look at, is stress high and is actual mitochondrial energy production low? And the two questions have to go together, because often you don't realize that you have low energy if you are that type that goes into an overly adrenalized state in response to a lack of mitochondrial energy. Generally, if you have a lack of mitochondrial energy, there's one of two like avenues you can go down. You can either go into the sympathetic state where you jack up your adrenaline and all the rest of it. In that case, as I said, like your ability to focus and process things tends to be as quick and as functional as ever, but the memory suffers. Or you go into more the dorsal vagal state, which is this kind of, to some degree, shut down state, this kind of partial hibernation state. And then when you do that, of course, everything slows down. It's kind of more of a depressed kind of state, but you're also going to tend to have low energy in general, not just in your brain. So if all of you is low energy, including your brain, then I would also look at the thyroid potentially and other things to do with basic energy. So that's kind of one element of energy for the brain. The other element of energy of the brain that I would look at straight away is blood sugar. I
Yeah,
think, again, there is an epidemic of hypoglycemia and insulin resistance, which is not recognized and not talked about, because, again, a lot of people are like avoiding some of the negative effects by abusing stimulants and by running on stress, which
yeah,
you don't have to take something to spike adrenaline in your system. You only have to, oh my god, this is going to happen, and this is why a lot of people become addicted to worrying and drama and all the rest of it, because it spikes their adrenaline. And again, if you do that, what happens is, often, unless you're very far advanced in that, you can still think and focus reasonably well. But again, it's like memory and creativity and being able to think outside the box and all those kind of more executive functions that are non-emergency based start to suffer. So yes, you're still able to focus and you're still able to think quickly, but first of all, memory goes, but then also your worldview kind of narrows. Often your decision making gets worse and worse because it's coming from this reactive stress like state. So that would be one of the other primary things that I would focus on. And so blood sugar, for instance, I see an epidemic of people in the health world who skip breakfast, intermittent fasting,
Yeah.
just drink coffee, maybe or just a juice or something like that. The problem is, if you're not having protein, carbs, and fat in the right ratio for you pretty soon after waking up, and I know the Eastern system, like the Taoist system, teaches this as well, your body starts cannibalizing your own, nutrient reserves, and it does that by raising cortisol and raising noradrenaline, raising adrenaline. It has to raise those stress chemicals to do gluconeogenesis and lipolysis and all the things to pull the energy out of storage. So you're negatively affecting cognitive function, but the problem is it doesn't feel like it, right? You wake up, you don't eat, you have a coffee, you're like, oh, my brain is good. And then maybe you eventually eat, maybe it's lunch, maybe it's dinner, and then you're like, oh, now I feel so tired and I can't think clearly anymore. But it's an illusion, because food, if it's the right food and done the right way, it gives you energy. Like, your body makes basic energy, whether you call it ATP or whether you call it chi, out of oxygen and glucose, like on the simplest level, right? So it's breathing and eating. And so if eating gives you less energy, that tells you you're running on stress, which again allows some of your brain functions to keep going for a long time. But a lot of those higher functions, creativity, good decision making, memory, all that kind of stuff will often like start to suffer quite early. So I would say, balancing blood sugar, making sure that your blood sugar doesn't crash, breakfast being the most important meal of the day, all that kind of stuff would be something I focus on. And of course, if you do feel like you have brain fog and all the rest of it after eating, then it's not that you should not eat half the day, especially the first half of the day. It's that you need to work out what's going on with your digestion or what's wrong with your diet that is making you have brain fog after you eat, because that's not normal. That's not the way it's supposed to be.
Yeah. Yeah, that's lovely. I think it's a biggie that we see in a lot of biohacking and in longevity of, oh, you've got to do intermittent fasting. And it's actually, it's more difficult for women to do that. And that is, you really said that very well. Thank you for that. That's, I think a lot of folks are going through those patterns, feeling like they're doing the right thing, and yet they're eating and then they crash. And that's a great marker that you're running on stress, and maybe get your hormone levels checked with a Dutch or a, diurnal cortisol pattern to see, well, what is going on there? Are you measuring your blood sugars? Diabetes of the brain is a real thing. Why we're seeing Alzheimer's, cognitive decline increase as we go forward here is there is a lot more sugar imbalances because of the food industry, and our diets have been hijacked by food processing, et cetera. So that was really a great, succinct way of putting it together. Yeah,
Thank you. And I would say women are also three times more likely to have thyroid issues, right? Like diagnosed normal thyroid issues. And I think it's absolutely related. To me, the key is like get your metabolism going faster, which you can tell by, like a 37 or 98.6 degree middle of the day, under the tongue kind of temperature. And if you've achieved that and you can maintain that, and then you add intermittent fasting and it doesn't reduce your metabolism, then intermittent fasting is great. But the problem is most people are doing intermittent fasting because they are not producing enough mitochondrial energy. So they're having all these health problems and probably feeling brain fog and feeling low energy. And then by doing periods of time of not eating, that slows down your metabolism even more. It raises your adrenaline even more, which makes the problem even worse. And the practical thing in terms of what you said there is the number one thing you hear from people is, but I'm not hungry when I wake up. It's like, But that is the number one sign that you're running on adrenaline. That's adrenaline dominance. If you wake up and you don't have not hungry in the sense of my energy is low, but if you don't have a grumbling in your stomach within an hour of waking up, you are almost certainly running on adrenaline. And that is not sustainable. Again, if you have good, strong genes, it's sustainable for a lot longer than people who have less strong genes in this sense. But eventually, it is always going to leave you depleted.
Yeah. Well,
Uh,
any last pieces on that brain health? Because I know we're just getting
yeah.
into it, and would like some more of the top level things for folks to think about.
I mean, I could talk about stress, but we kind of already have. I can talk about inflammation, but I guess you hear about it a lot. Let's talk about like something that's maybe a little bit more interesting to people, and that would be dopamine. You know,
Yeah.
so dopamine is the neurotransmitter which gives you focus, and which gives you energy. Like, sorry, not energy. I just described energy. Enthusiasm, motivation, passion, drive, ambition, all of those kind of words are dependent on dopamine. So my
Yeah.
understanding of dopamine from an evolutionary point of view is it's the thing that makes you want things. And so the secondary function of dopamine, because it's the thing that makes you want things, is it also is the thing that gives you mental clarity. Because throughout most of our evolution, for most of our mammal distant relatives or however you want to put it, there is always a problem of there's basic life is two things. It's getting away from things which are dangerous. So it's being able to spot that, and that's more done through adrenaline and noradrenaline and cortisol, the things that I've just talked about. But the other side of it is getting things that you want. So, and this is usually food or mating opportunities of the type that you like. And so, a lot of people, I would say, if you're the kind of person who's like, I have enough energy still, Elwin. I don't relate to everything you said, but I just don't have much joy in my life anymore, and my brain's starting to slow down, and maybe I'm kind of worrying too much, and I'm not happy, and I find it hard to relax and all the rest of it. I'd say the reason why you're still functional and still able to maybe earn a lot of money and run a household and 5 kids and all that stuff is because your adrenaline and your cortisol is keeping you going. But the reason why you're lacking joy and the reason why you're lacking motivation, like if I'm doing it because I love to or because I want to, is because the dopamine is not there anymore. So in my experience, I'm sure you see exactly the same thing. Dopamine collapses before cortisol and adrenaline, which is because staying alive in terms of in an emergency situation is more fundamental than getting things that you want from a
Yeah.
design point of view. And so I would look at dopamine as one of the first things. The other element of it is memory and stuff like that, which I would look more at choline and the PEMT gene specifically, and stuff like that when it comes to memory. But yeah, so those would be like my two starting places. But let's talk about dopamine a little bit more. So
Yeah.
some people naturally have high dopamine. Some people naturally have low dopamine, and many people are in the middle. That's super, super important to find out about yourself, especially if you have a genetic tendency for low dopamine. You are absolutely going to have addictive tendencies of one type or another. And you are going to find it very difficult to just like focus and whether it's on studying or in your work or whatever it is you might need to do. And you might find it very tempting to go on social media or shopping or gambling or pornography or whatever it might be. Even let's talk about the fairly innocuous addictions, let alone drug addiction and sex addiction,
Right.
all the kind of life destroying ones. But you're going to find it very difficult, and that's because you're constantly trying to raise your dopamine to a point of feeling okay. And so that's very important to know about yourself. There's a gene called COMT. I don't know if you talked about it on your podcast before.
No.
Okay, let's talk about that one just briefly if we have time for that. This is a
Yeah.
very interesting gene. As you asked for a gene, I'll give you a gene. So
Yes.
COMT COMT is the gene which breaks down catecholamines, which are a specific class of stress chemicals. And they basically consist of adrenaline, noradrenaline, sometimes called epinephrine and norepinephrine, and dopamine. And dopamine is a key point. So some people break those down very quickly. Some people break them down very slowly. Obviously, many people are in between. But again, that is very important to know about yourself. Are you fast comped or slow comped, especially? And so, a lot of genes, a lot of the difference between is basically just how quick or how slow they work. That's often, that has huge repercussions, but that's when you really boil it down, that's like the simplistic way of looking at it. And so that's true for this compt. And so if you have a tendency to break stress chemicals down quickly, then you have a serious advantage in life, which is often obvious, but also a serious disadvantage, which may not be immediately obvious. The serious advantage to breaking down stress chemicals quickly is if you are in a war zone, if you're in a highly difficult, stressful situation, you have an amazing resilience. Because whereas someone who breaks them down slowly, the stress chemicals might build up more and more until they start to feel overwhelmed and, be seriously traumatized and have a nervous breakdown and all the rest of it, you're okay. So that's a serious, and I'm not that kind of person. I always used to look at that kind of person and go, oh God, I wish I was more resilient. I wish I was like that. I wish I could take things in my stride. I wish things were no big deal to me, like those kind of people. And they're often called like the warrior gene. This is often called the warrior. But I think warrior is the wrong term for it. I would like to suggest a new one for compt. It's actually the wizard warrior, because the other type, the type that is slow comped, they have they break down stress chemicals slowly, but that also means that they break down dopamine slowly. So the disadvantage that they have is in a stressful situation, they're more likely to become overwhelmed. If it continues for too long, they're more likely to shut down, have a nervous breakdown, all of that kind of stuff, panic attack, all of that. But they also have an advantage. And the fast compt has a disadvantage, which is in a peaceful situation, a fast comp person who breaks down stress chemicals very quickly, they become bored and they can't focus on anything. And often they will actually create stress, they will create drama, they will create crisis, they will create war because they only feel good in that situation. I remember listening to an interview of a boxer, and they said, why do you do it? You don't get paid very much. It's, like brutal, you brain damage, all the rest of it. He goes, it's the only time I'm not bored. That's what he said. So that's that's a classic fast comped warrior gene. That is often how they feel. And as much as I was always like envious of those people who are very resilient being in a crisis, I was also like, why does this person seem to keep creating a crisis situation unnecessarily? Like I never quite understood that either. But when I understood genes, I understood, oh. And so the slow comp person, because they break down adrenaline and noradrenaline slowly. Okay, not great, but they also break down dopamine slowly. And dopamine is the primary neurotransmitter that makes you feel good and gives you ability to focus and makes your brain work well and makes your brain work quickly and all the rest of it. And so the way I look at it now is if you are fast comped, you're more a warrior type who is genetically predisposed to thrive in a chaotic, stressful environment. But if you are the wizard type, the slow comp who breaks down the neurotransmitters, especially dopamine, slowly, you are more likely to thrive in a peaceful, harmonious environment. And so both of them have an advantage, both of them have a disadvantage. So that's one example. But of course, when it comes to brain, like if talk about GABA, it's great to have high levels of GABA in many ways. It keeps you, again, from being stressed and overwhelmed and all the rest of it. But if you have high levels of GABA, you're kind of in a sedated state a lot of the time. And you kind of need something to break out of it. And for maybe a stimulant, of coffee is actually a good idea because it will raise your adrenaline and norepinephrine levels enough that you can kind of have mental energy and think clearly and all the rest of it. The endocannabinoids make a difference to mental clarity. There are advantages and disadvantages to having high or low levels of the endocannabinoids. Serotonin is a bit of a controversial one, but if that's high or low, oxytocin, if that's high or low, cortisol, if that's high or low, noradrenaline, if that's high or low. So we have reports on each of those, and each of those, they may not be a big deal for you because yours may just be normal and it may not be something to worth focusing on. But if you, it's like, I have a tendency to high cortisol. Oh, I have a tendency to low dopamine. Oh, I have a tendency to, slow compt or whatever it might be. Again, I can't tell you it's the one thing, except for maybe with cellular energy and blood sugar and the inflammation, these very basic things. But like finding that one, this is the thing that for me is causing like all my problems can be really, really enlightening.
That is awesome. Elwin Robinson of Genetic Insights dropping some knowledge bombs here today. Thank you so much. Any last parting words for our listeners and viewers?
Yeah, if you'd like to see this for yourself, well, first of all, if you'd like to learn more from me, youtube.com/Elwin Robinson is my YouTube channel. I have a lot of episodes on like topic focused, and I do have a full episode on brain health that goes into a lot more detail about this as well as non-genetic factors. So check that out. Um, and if you would like to try our genetic service for yourself, go to geneticinsights.co. And if you use the coupon code E4LWTH, then I'm happy to offer you an additional 25% off. As I said, I think we're already industry leading in terms of being more affordable than anyone else who offers any kind of comparable service. But I'd like to offer an additional 25% off for your viewers and listeners to thank them for listening all the way to the end of the podcast.
Love it. Awesome. Well, thank you all. If you got something out of today's podcast, please go out, give us a thumbs up, give us a 5-star review, let people know what you learned, what you're taking away from this one. I'd like to know too. You can put it down in the comments. Would love to see what you thought of today's episode. We wouldn't be doing it without you. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.